Jerome Caldwell was 42 years old when his wife of 7 years kissed him on the cheek, told him not to wait up, and walked out the front door in a dress she had bought that he had never seen before. Heading to a work dinner with a man who had in fact been married for 40 years, just not faithfully, and not to anyone who was paying attention. She had no idea Jerome had spent the last 11 weeks building a case so precise and so complete that the attorney who reviewed it said she had never seen pre-litigation documentation assembled with this level of structural clarity. She had no idea the restaurant she was walking into was owned by a hospitality group in which Jerome held a quiet equity stake. She had never been more wrong about the man she had left watching television alone on a Wednesday evening in his own living room. What she walked back into that Thursday morning would take everything she thought she had secured and leave her with nothing she had not earned herself. Before we jump into the story, comment where in the world you are watching from and subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you need to hear. The alarm went off at 5:30 a.m., and Jerome Caldwell was already awake. He had been awake since 4:50, lying in the dark with his eyes open and his hands still at his sides, running through the shape of the day with the quiet, methodical attention that had been his particular mode of operating since he was old enough to understand that the world did not organize itself on your behalf. You organized yourself. You woke before it required you to. You were already moving when the alarm went off, which was why the alarm was almost always unnecessary and was kept only as a courtesy to the version of himself that might one day need it. He dressed in the dark. Diane was asleep, her breathing even, one arm over the edge of the pillow in the way she slept, and he moved around the room without sound and pulled the door behind him and went to the kitchen. He made coffee the way he always made it, French press, 4 minutes. No compromise on the steep time, and stood at the kitchen counter in the early morning dark and looked out at the yard. The yard was his most recent project. He had spent the previous 2 summers redesigning it from the flat, featureless rectangle of grass it had been when they bought the house into something with structure. A low stone retaining wall along the back border that he had laid himself, stone by stone, over 6 weekends. A flagstone path from the deck to the garden beds, the beds themselves framed in cedar that he had cut and joined at the corners with half-lap joints, because half-lap joints lasted and butt joints eventually did not. He had done it all after work and on weekends, in the evenings when the light lasted long enough, and on Saturday mornings when Diane was still asleep, because building things was how he organized himself when the desk work was done, and his mind needed something it could hold in its hands. Jerome Caldwell was a financial architect. That was the term his firm used, though he was indifferent to it. What he did, in specific terms, was structure complex debt and equity arrangements for mid-market real estate development, which meant he spent his days identifying the load-bearing points in a capital stack and making certain they would hold under the weight of what was being built above them. He had been doing this for 16 years. He was very good at it. He was good at it for the same reason he was good at the stone wall and the flagstone path and the cedar beds. He thought about structure before he thought about anything else, and he did not proceed until the structure was sound. He had learned this from his father, who had been a civil engineer and who had raised Jerome in a household where the first question asked of any plan was not whether it was attractive or ambitious, but whether it would hold. Will it hold? Jerome. His father had asked this about homework, and about friendships, and about every decision Jerome had brought to him through childhood and adolescence. Not, is it a good idea? Not, do you want it? Will it hold? Jerome had carried this question into adulthood and applied it to everything, including his marriage, which he had believed until 14 weeks ago was as sound as anything he had ever built. He had been wrong. And the way he had been wrong was instructive, because the flaw had not been in the structure he had built. It had been in a material he had not assessed carefully enough. Her name was Diane. She was 39, a senior account manager at a financial services firm downtown, bright and organized and funny in the specific way of women who have always been the most competent person in most rooms and have learned to carry that lightly. He had loved that about her from the first evening they had spent together. The ease with which she held her own intelligence, the way she never performed it. They had been together for 2 years before they married, and he had spent those 2 years with the sustained attentiveness he brought to any significant assessment, watching how she operated under pressure and how she handled disagreement and who she was when things went wrong, and everything he had observed had confirmed what his first instinct had told him. She was sound. She would hold. He had been wrong. The flaw had been there. He simply had not known where to look. The boss's name was Richard Haas. He had been at the firm for 22 years and ran the institutional accounts division, and was, by all external evidence, exactly the kind of senior executive that described itself as a mentor, generous with career guidance, attentive to high-performing junior staff. The sort of man who was known in the building for remembering the names of people's children and following up on things he had been told in passing. He had a wife of 40 years, as Diane had told Jerome more than once, in the specific way people offer biographical details that are meant to establish safety. He had 4 grandchildren. He played golf badly and talked about it too much and laughed at himself for both. He was, Diane had always said, a good man. Jerome had met him 3 times at firm events. He had found him pleasant and professionally accomplished, and had thought nothing further about him because there had been no reason to. The reason arrived on a Sunday afternoon in July when Jerome came home from a site visit earlier than expected and heard the end of a phone call he was not meant to hear. He had come through the back door off the deck, the way he usually came in from the yard, and Diane was in the kitchen facing the window with her phone at her ear, and what he caught as he came through the door, a fragment, 15 words, a tone, was enough. Not proof, not specifics. Enough to know that something in the structure had shifted, that a load-bearing point he had relied on was carrying a different weight than he had understood it to be carrying. He did not say anything. He came in and set his work bag down and poured himself water and said something ordinary about the afternoon, and she turned from the window and said something ordinary back, and they moved into the evening the way they always moved into evenings, making dinner and watching something after and going to bed. And the entire time Jerome was doing what he always did when he identified a potential structural failure he was beginning to assess. He spent the next 3 weeks observing with the focused stillness that his professional life had made second nature. He was not searching. He was paying the kind of attention he would pay to a capital stack, showing signs of stress, not panicked attention, not suspicious attention, but precise, documentarian attention, cataloging what he saw without yet interpreting it. The late arrivals on Tuesdays and Thursdays, which had been occasional in the spring and were now consistent through the summer. The way her phone had migrated from the counter to her person, carried with her in the specific manner of someone managing information on a device they no longer leave unattended. A dinner in August she had described as a team event, the details of which she had offered in the slightly over-prepared way of someone who has rehearsed them. A weekend conference in September for which the hotel she named was 40 minutes from the conference venue rather than adjacent to it. He did not confront. He cataloged. On the evening she told him about the Wednesday dinner, a work dinner, she said. Richard and a few of the senior team. A client relationship thing. She probably wouldn't be home before 10. He said that was fine, and asked what she wanted for dinner before she left, and made it. And while he made it, he thought about Richard Haas, and about what he had observed over 11 weeks, and about what a man. built things properly did when he understood that a foundational element was not what it had appeared to be. He called his attorney the next morning. Her name was Catherine Obie, and she had practiced family law for 18 years, and before that had spent 6 years as a litigator, which meant she did not waste motion. He had used her for contract matters twice before, and trusted her judgment the way he trusted the judgment of professionals who answered questions directly. He laid out what he had in 15 minutes. She was quiet for a moment when he finished, and then she said, "Get me documentation. Dates, patterns, financial anomalies if there are any. Don't confront. Don't signal. Bring me paper." He brought her paper. The financial anomalies required a forensic accountant, a man named Stephen Bray, who worked out of a small office near the courthouse and who had the quality Jerome most valued in technical professionals, which was that he explained his findings in plain language and did not pad his conclusions. Stephen took 3 weeks and came back with a report that showed $67,000 moved out of joint accounts over 16 months in increments that were consistently sized to stay below review thresholds. The sizing, Stephen noted, suggested some familiarity with financial compliance parameters. Jerome noted this without surprise, because Diane worked in financial services and would have known exactly what she was doing. He read the report at his office desk on a Thursday morning, door closed, and sat with it for a while after he finished the last page. $67,000. 16 months. He thought about the Sunday afternoons he had spent laying the stone retaining wall while she was inside the house, and about the cedar bed joints, and about his father's question, and about what it meant that something he had measured twice and believed to be sound had been, the whole time, failing in a place he hadn't thought to check. He put the report in the leather folio he had bought for this purpose and drove to Catherine's office. She read the summary page while he sat across from her. She set it down. "This is clean," she said. "This is very clean documentation, Jerome. I know how to document," he said. "I see that." She looked at him over the desk with the direct assessment of someone taking a measure. "You're not angry." "I'm angry," he said. "I'm quite angry. But angry doesn't build anything." She almost smiled at that. "No," she said. "It doesn't." They discussed strategy for 40 minutes. The premarital assets were clearly structured and protected. He had been disciplined about this from the beginning. Not from distrust, but from the same structural instinct that governed everything. Because clean financial architecture was always preferable to complicated financial architecture, regardless of the circumstances. The marital estate was straightforward. The $67,000 recovery was documentable and pursuable. And there was one other element he had not yet mentioned, which he mentioned now. He told her about the hospitality group. The Meridian Hospitality Group was a partnership he had entered 4 years ago with 2 colleagues from the industry. A quiet equity position in a collection of 3 restaurants in the downtown corridor. It was not a large holding. It was not the most significant element of his financial picture. But one of the 3 restaurants was called Saletta, which was the restaurant Diane had named when she told him about Wednesday's dinner, the place she and Richard and the senior team would be having their client relationship evening. Catherine looked at him for a moment. "She doesn't know about the hospitality group." "She knows I've made investments over the years," Jerome said. "She has not asked for specifics. And the restaurant is one of mine," he said. "Partially, the manager there has worked with the group since we acquired it. He knows who I am." Catherine was quiet for a moment. "I want to be clear about something," she said. "We are not going to do anything improper with that information." "I know," Jerome said. "I'm not asking for anything improper. I'm simply noting that I have access to information through legitimate channels that may be relevant to documentation." She considered this. The manager observed what was observable, she said carefully, in the normal course of operating a restaurant. That is correct, Jerome said. She made a note on her legal pad. All right, she said. Let me know what comes back. What came back, through a conversation Jerome had with the manager on Thursday morning, a call about a routine partnership matter that happened to include an observation about the previous evening's reservations, and a detail about a guest who had presented a corporate card that bounced on the first swipe and a second card on the second. A personal card, and the name on the reservation was sufficient. Not dramatic, not explosive. Sufficient, the kind of specific, documented, observable fact that did not require interpretation and did not invite dispute. He added it to the folio. Diane came home Thursday morning at 7:45. Jerome was in the kitchen with his coffee, second cup, work bag already packed, site notebook in his jacket pocket. She came in through the front door, and he heard her set her keys on the hook, and he waited. She appeared in the kitchen doorway. She was still in the dress from the night before, a coat over it now, and she looked at him with the expression of someone arriving to a situation whose temperature they cannot yet read. "Morning," she said. "Morning," he said. "Coffee's fresh." She came to the counter and poured a cup and wrapped both hands around it and stood across from him. She was performing a version of ordinary. He watched it without hostility and without warmth and without the performance of either, which was simply how he looked at things when he was reading them clearly. "Good dinner?" he said. "Long," she said. The client went late. He nodded. He picked up his work bag. He looked at her once more, steadily and without expression, and then he said, "I'm going to be late tonight. Don't wait up." He used her own words from the previous evening without emphasis, without inflection, delivered as simple information. Something shifted in her face. A small thing, quickly managed. He noted it. He went to work. He called Catherine from the car and told her he was ready to move. She filed that afternoon the documentation package she submitted, the forensic accounting report, the pattern evidence, the restaurant record, the asset protection filing, was, in her later description to a colleague, one of the most methodically prepared pre-litigation packets she had received from a client in 18 years of practice. She said this not as flattery, but as a professional assessment of someone who understood how structure worked. Jerome received the confirmation of filing at 4:17 p.m. and put his phone in his jacket pocket and went back to the capital stack analysis he had been working on all afternoon. Because the work was ongoing and the Westfield project needed his attention, and the structure of the day did not pause for personal matters when the personal matters had already been properly handled. Diane was served on Friday morning. He was not in the house when it happened. He had gone to the site early, the way he always went to the site early, and he learned of the service from Catherine in a message at 8:45 a.m. He read the message, replied with a single acknowledgement, and continued the site walk. His brother Darius called him at noon. Darius was 5 years younger and worked in architecture, and was the only person in Jerome's life who could ask him direct questions and receive direct answers, which was a rare quality Jerome valued highly. "She called me," Darius said. "I assumed she would," Jerome said. Darius paused. "She's not well, Jerome. She sounds genuinely shaken." "I imagine she does." "What are you feeling?" Jerome thought about the question with the seriousness it deserved, because Darius deserved that, and because Jerome was not a man who answered important questions carelessly. "I'm feeling clear," he said. "I've felt clear for about 11 weeks. The clarity is not comfortable, but it is preferable to the alternative." Darius was quiet for a moment. "Did you know about the restaurant?" "I found out Wednesday morning." "And you said nothing?" "I had nothing to gain from saying something Wednesday. Jerome said. I had everything to gain from saying something Friday. Darius made a sound that was not quite a laugh. Dad would have said exactly that. Dad would have said the structure was clear, and you don't rush a pour, Jerome said, which is the same thing. You're okay. I'm going to be okay, Jerome said. There's a distinction, but yes. The settlement process took 11 weeks. Richard Haas's involvement in the financial transfers, his advice, his presence during certain decisions, the paper trail that Stephen Bray had identified, created a secondary complexity that required his firm's attention as well. He resigned in the third week of the proceedings, quietly and without public statement, and Jerome heard about it through the ordinary channels of a city where industries overlap and people talk. And he received the information the way he received all information about the situation now, as data, without satisfaction and without dwelling. Diane's attorney, a man named Paul Ferris, who was competent and who had the good sense to look carefully at the documentation before making aggressive opening claims, presented a reasonable opening position at the settlement meeting. The meeting took place on a Tuesday morning in January in Catherine's conference room, which was clean and warm and held a long table of dark wood and good chairs and windows through which the winter light came in at a low, even angle. Jerome arrived early. He arranged his folders and his legal notepad and his pen. He poured water. He sat down. Diane came in with Paul Ferris at 10:02. She was dressed carefully. She had not looked directly at him since the morning he had come home and found her in the doorway of their kitchen, and she did not look directly at him now. She sat across the table and looked at the documents in front of her, and Jerome watched her profile and thought about 7 years and about what 7 years meant. And then he looked at the window and the winter light and made himself clean and ready for what came next. Paul Ferris's opening was careful. He had clearly read Stephen Bray's report and had no interest in contesting the forensic accounting, which was professionally sound of him. He proposed a division of the marital estate that was not unreasonable on its face and did not address the premarital asset question directly, which was the tell. If he'd had a viable argument there, he would have led with it. Catherine let him finish and then opened the first folder. She laid out the premarital asset structure. She laid out the $67,000 recovery claim. She laid out the documentation from Soletta, which Paul Ferris read with the expression of someone reading a document he had hoped would not exist. She laid out a secondary element Jerome had not discussed here yet, a property he had acquired 14 months before the marriage through a trust his father had established. A small commercial building in the east side of the city that was currently generating rental income and whose existence and current value, $1.4 million, was entirely premarital and entirely protected. The room was quiet for a moment after Catherine finished. Paul Ferris leaned to his left and spoke quietly to Diane. Jerome watched her listen. Her expression moved through something he had no word for. Not surprise exactly. Because surprise requires a prior certainty that can be disturbed, and Jerome was not certain what certainty she'd had. Something more like the specific rearrangement of a room you thought you knew when a wall you had assumed was interior turns out to be load-bearing. The structure was different than she had understood it to be. It had always been different. She simply had not looked. The meeting took 3 hours. At the end of 3 hours, a settlement had been reached that Catherine would later describe as comprehensive, and Paul Ferris would later describe to no one. Jerome had full protection of the premarital assets, full recovery of the marital account drawdown with interest, and a division of the remaining marital estate along lines that were equitable and clean and would not require revisiting. Jerome signed the final document at 1:08 p.m. He put the cap on his pen. He closed the leather folio. He stood. Diane was still sitting. She looked up at him then for the first time that day, directly, and he looked at her. It was not a long look. It held no hostility and no warmth and no performance of either. It was simply the look of a man who has completed an assessment and is ready to move to the next one. He said, "I hope you're all right, Diane." She looked at him and did not say anything. He nodded once. He picked up the folio. He thanked Catherine and the paralegal by name and walked to the elevator and pressed the button and stood waiting with his hands loose at his sides, not checking his phone, not reviewing the morning, simply standing in the ordinary posture of a man with work to do. He drove to the site. The Westfield project was in its third phase and was running, as his projects tended to run, 4 days ahead of schedule. He walked the east foundation in the winter light, his boots on the packed ground, his notebook in his hand, his eyes on the work. The crew foreman met him at the south end and walked with him, and they discussed the column spacing on the north face and a material substitution in the second-floor framing that would save 11 days on the back end of the schedule. Jerome made notes. He approved the substitution. He asked 2 questions and listened to both answers completely before moving on. He walked the length of the site from south to north and back again, and when he reached the south end again, he stood for a moment and looked at what was being built. It was going to hold. He could see that clearly from where he stood, from the foundation and the framing and the way the load was distributed across the structure. It was going to hold because it had been built correctly from the beginning, because the load-bearing points had been identified and assessed before anything was placed on top of them, because the structure had been sound before the building began. He drove home at 5:30 in the December dark. He parked in the driveway and sat with the engine off for a moment, listening to the cooling tick of metal in the cold. Then he went inside. The house was quiet in the specific way of a house that is between its current chapter and its next one. He had already begun to think about the next one, not sentimentally, not impatiently, but in the way of a man who builds things and therefore always has a next project forming in the background, always has a plan that is slightly ahead of the present. He had looked at 2 properties in October. He had not rushed. He made dinner. He ate at the kitchen table. He looked out at the dark yard, at the stone wall he had laid stone by stone across 6 weekends, at the flagstone path, at the cedar beds with their half-lap corner joints, and he thought about his father. Will it hold, Jerome? He thought about everything he had built in his life, the walls and the beds, and the capital stacks, and the 15 years of work, and the stone in the cold ground, and the folio of documents, and the case that Catherine had called one of the most methodically prepared she had received. And he thought about the question his father had asked of every plan, every structure, every material, every decision. Will it hold? Yes, he thought. What I build holds. What she built had depended on a picture she had assembled and never verified. A reading of him that she had accepted at the surface because the surface was all she had thought to examine. She had looked at the yard work and the ordinary car and the quiet evenings at home, and the way he did not announce himself, and she had assembled from these details a picture of a man who could be managed, a man who would absorb what was done to him and not know how to respond, a man without the resources or the will to do anything but let her go. She had been doing what people do when they mistake patience for passivity and silence for limitation. She had built her plan on a foundation she had not assessed. She had not asked the right question. He finished dinner. He washed the plate and dried it, and put it back in the correct cabinet. He poured the last of his coffee into his mug and took it to the back door and stood in the open doorway for a moment in the cold, looking out at the dark yard, at the stone wall and the path and the cedar beds he had built with his own hands on weekend mornings while she was still asleep. And the cold air came in around him, and he did not move away from it. Then he went inside. He set his alarm for 5:30 a.m. He put his phone face down on the nightstand. He lay down in the dark and closed his eyes. There was work in the morning. There was always work in the morning. The structure was sound. The load-bearing points had held. And whatever came next, he would build the same way he had built everything, from the foundation up, with the right materials, taking the time it required, measuring twice, cutting once, secured to last. He did not look back. There was nothing behind him that needed his eyes. I hope you enjoyed that one. Be sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. I've picked out 2 more for you that I think you'll really like.